Do my best with voice projection. Just if you can't hear me up the back and I start fading off, just start waving randomly and I'll try and speak a bit louder. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what our organisation does. So Science for Wildlife, we run the Blue Mountains Koala project up here. You might have seen us in the news about, well, in December, we pulled some koalas out in front of the fire front in Canangra and took them to Taronga Zoo. We're currently planning for release of those koalas, hopefully in a couple of weeks. So we've been running the Koala project for about 5 years now and had different sites across the World Heritage Area. So from southeast Wallamai National Park down into Kurrajong area. We have a site in the northern section of Canangra. We're finding koalas down the southern section as well. Kazumba Valley, Nunes Plateau, and also lower mountains. So we did, until the fires, have a real story of hope. So we found the koalas in the mountains have the highest genetic diversity in the country. We've also found populations like the one at Canangra that are chlamydia-free, which is also a pretty rare and special thing. So those were two of the things that were sort of behind our desperate measure, basically, of trying to get some koalas out, because at that stage, that Canangra fire, the Greenwater Creek fire, was just working its way north, taking out most of everything in its path. So yeah, our story of hope has now turned a bit bleak because 4 of those 5 koala populations got hit by fire. Between 75 to 100% of habitat at each site has been impacted. We don't know how bad it is at the moment. There's some slightly good news coming out in terms they're doing some fire intensity mapping. So when you look at that Fires Near Me app, I don't know about you, but it became my new TV during December and January, looking at about 50 times a day, watching the fires grow. And from that, it looks really bleak, in terms of the area that these fires were covering. And what we were hearing on the ground is very intense fire in most areas. But what we're seeing in the fire intensity mapping is that there are some patches of hope. There's some low intensity burns where the fires just trickled down through gullies, potentially skip gullies. So there's mapping coming out through national parks and wildlife and some unis. It's called GBAM. And you can look at the fire intensity maps for that. So we're trying to get into the low intensity areas at the moment. What we have learned through these fires, and a lot of people have had the same experience, I think, is there's just no protocols or processes in place for an emergency of this scale. So our first thing was proactive, let's try and get in and get some animals out. That hasn't really been done before. Normally you'd have about a 6-month process of animal ethics and permitting procedures to be able to do something like that. But National Parks was really supportive because everybody was just watching, 80% of the World Heritage Area burn. The other issues we've had have been trying to get access to fire grounds, so going in after the fire to try and get resources out for wildlife. So we work mostly on the national park with these populations, but a lot of the koalas in particular do come into developed areas where the soils are a bit better, so they turn up in people's backyards as well. So I've been going to a lot of workshops. There's been a couple of hearings for a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry. I was in Canberra 2 days ago for a ministerial roundtable. There's a New South Wales koala strategy that's being revised at the moment too. And we're all having input on what we think needs to happen to facilitate faster access. Because on top of this fire, we've obviously had drought. That's been a major problem too. Some areas you'll see in Hartley and the Megalong, it looks like a fire's been through and it's just dead canopy from the drought and the heat stress events. We had greater gliders dropping out of trees when we had those 40-degree days in a row. So it's had some really big impacts. So what we're doing now is not just fire recovery, it's also drought recovery. So we tried to do search and rescue where we could get in. Unfortunately, particularly in this World Heritage Area, you might have seen on the news like Port Macquarie Koala Hospital, they had a lot of koalas coming into care from the burn zone. So in those areas, they're pretty accessible. So, the koalas in the developed areas, you can go in and look for them and get them. Here you've got, a wilderness area. It's a 2-day walk through a burn zone, which you're not allowed to go into. So unfortunately, a lot of the wildlife inside the park where there's been an intense burn has just been lost. They've died in situ. We did put quite a few weeks into search and rescue efforts. And then we moved on to food and water. So the emphasis now is trying to keep animals alive that survived the fires and that have so far survived the drought as well. So we've been doing water stations and food drops. So we're using the koalas as a flagship species. So they've probably become the symbol, I think, of the wildlife crisis. Everybody relates to koalas, they're iconic. They also really suffer from fire because their reaction is generally to go to the top of a tree. They don't flee from the fire like a kangaroo does. So we're using koalas, obviously they need eucalypt forests as a target, and other threatened species like greater gliders, and we're targeting those areas to put in these food and water resources where we can. We're learning a lot about this. So again, there's been a lot of discussions about what people should do. A lot of people have wanted to help. We've had a lot of volunteers sign up, which has been great, and they're helping to maintain water stations and food drops for us now as well. But one of the things a lot of people have been discussing is what's the best information to get out for helping wildlife. So firstly, water, absolutely. That's probably, it's the safest thing to do. There are protocols you need to follow when you're putting out water for wildlife, and I have a little show and tell item. Just hang on a sec. This is one of our water stations. So this is an arboreal one. You might have seen something like this. There's a much taller version that just sits on the ground. It was developed for the arid recovery program, and there's a bit of magic in it. Oh. Yeah, thank you. Here it is. Da-da-da-da. Goes that way in the tree. So yeah, the version on the ground is much taller than this. You just tie it to a tree basically. The good things about this, it's solid. The light can't get in. If you put out transparent containers of water, the sunlight gets in and you get algae growth much quicker. So something that's solid is much better. Something that's an auto refill is also good. So for example, this one, it just works on a vacuum. The top's really sealed. You turn it up this way to fill it. There's a little bit that goes in the mouthpiece there to fill it up. And when you flip it, it's just got a gravity feed. It just automatically refills. There's also dog auto refill bowls that we've been jerry-rigging with jerry cans and putting those on the ground as well. So it's important to think about what you're putting the water out for. If you're putting it on the ground, try and go for something that's a shallow bowl. A lot of animals aren't going to be able to get up a steep-sided, really tall bucket or a recycling crate, for instance, unless there's a ramp or something there. Make sure you put rocks and sticks in it so that things can't drown. So you will get reptiles and smaller mammals going in for water that can't get back out again. So that's why something that's got a small drinking piece like this or is quite shallow is really good. If you're putting out just a shallow container, make sure you change it and clean the water every day. So same with mammals as for birds. It's all about hygiene. You want to make sure it stays clean for as long as possible. These are pretty good because they don't get contaminated very easily, again, because no light gets in. In terms of food, that's where it gets really complicated. So if you're in an area and you have intact bush and shrubs and stuff around you, the safest thing to do is not to put out food, unless you're right on the edge of a fire zone. There's been a lot of stories, a lot of information going around the internet, some of it good, some of it bad. Things like peanut butter balls, they kill macropods. Food that you'd put up a tree for possums and gliders that's high in sugar, if that falls to the ground, that'll make macropods sick. So if you think of, and when I say macropods, I mean kangaroos, wallabies, that sort of thing. If you think what they normally eat, they're grazing and they eat grass, so really high fibre diets. If they're suddenly getting really high carbohydrate and sugar loads, that changes their gut into something that's really acidic. It can give them ulcers and it can also kill them eventually. So at the moment we're putting out things like macropod pellets, so specialised roo pellets. Rabbit pellets are good for wombats, and you can also get equine pellets that don't have any sugar or anything in them. So anything grain-based is not ideal. Don't put bird seed on the ground either. It is unfortunately really tricky because different species like different foods. Some of them adapt to foods really quickly, others get impacted by them. So just play it safe. If you're putting something up for possums or gliders, make sure it's up a tree. If you're putting something on the ground, make sure it's just really high fibre and really simple. Talk to your local wildlife group about it, basically, before you put anything out, because although a lot of people mean really well, if you put the wrong thing out, it can actually be harming the wildlife instead of helping it. We can help get access to pellets, things like macropod pellets and rabbit pellets, if anybody wants to start. If you're in an area where you're right on the edge of a burn zone and you're seeing animals that are suffering, then let us know. There's a really good group. It's called ARC and it's on Facebook, and they're helping get pellets up from South Australia. Putting things out, you can put hay and some grasses on private properties. We're not putting that anywhere near the national park because that can spread weeds as well, and you can have fungal loads and things in grasses, so you can actually cause problems in the national park. The other thing I wanted to touch on is access. So it's been really frustrating for everyone trying to get into the burn zones where the animals most need the help to get resources out there. So if the national park's closed, it's for good reason. Just to let you know, we've ended up getting our own tree assessment team in, so that we've got a qualified arborist that goes in front of us and looks for hazardous trees to make sure that we're safe, and we're just in a low intensity burn zone. And even though we're doing that, we've heard trees come down within 80 metres of us. So the tree fall risk is very real, And that's why national parks and council have made some areas a no-go zone. Until enough weather has gone through, there's actually a very real risk of someone being hit by a tree. And if it's in one of these fire grounds, it's actually the liability of the incident controller, which has been rural fire service for all the Section 44 fires. Otherwise, it's national parks. So do check. There are fire trails opening up now. So we've been going onto fire trails as soon as they open, trying to get these water stations out and food drops as well. And if you want to help, we are still taking volunteers. One of the things that's still happening, the drought hasn't broken from this rain, although we've had a lot, and the canopy is going to take a while to recover. So particularly for koalas, which is an animal that gets its moisture from the leaves normally, if they've got really poor quality canopy, we're going to keep putting water up trees, because what we don't want is arboreal animals having to come to ground for water because there's no cover from the fire, and so the predators are having a field day basically. So invasive species are a bit of a risk as well. So you've got to watch for disease spread. If you're putting out the different foods on the ground, you don't want to be attracting invasive predators and helping them instead of the native wildlife either. So I guess the take-home message is have a chat to some wildlife people before you put food out. And if you're in an area that needs it, have a chat to me, have a chat to Wires. There's a new document which I have in my hand here. The Wildlife Health of Australia, Wildlife Health Australia, has just came out yesterday afternoon. It's a new document with all the guidelines on what you should put out for what species and how, for food and water. And the National Parks and Wildlife website has adopted it really quickly. It's all updated on their website as well. So there's 2 links, and you can just go on and read that to find the information you need to make sure you're helping wildlife. Thank you.